Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar entitled The Taxonomy of Data Quality. This webinar is sponsored by Clinical Architecture. The webinar runs from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern, and it is being recorded for archiving and future viewing purposes. Once the webinar has concluded and the recording has been confirmed, it will be freely available on the AMIA website in the Knowledge Center using the filter for webinars and on demand. There will be time for questions and discussion during the final 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation. So as you think of questions throughout the webinar, please type them into the Zoom chat area. The moderator will review your questions and will address them during the allotted Q&A time. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for the webinar, Jamie Lira, Vice President of Marketing for Clinical Architecture. Jamie, I welcome you and turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Dina, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We hope you find this session informative and insightful. So allow me to introduce our speaker. Charlie Harp is the founder and CEO of Clinical Architecture, an industry-leading healthcare data quality solutions provider. Charlie has over 20 years of experience as a healthcare software engineer and systems architect, focused on creating tools to better utilize and understand data. Through this experience, he saw a need within the healthcare industry for reliable, accurate, and interoperable patient data to support clinical decision-making, research, and operational initiatives. Charlie created Clinical Architecture and led his team to design and develop the first deterministic, configurable, and algorithm-based engine for automating semantic interoperability to answer this need. Charlie frequently presents on healthcare data quality topics and serves as the host of the InfoMonster podcast, which provides insight and expertise on a variety of healthcare information technology topics. And now, Charlie Harp.
Thank you, Jamie. Hi, everybody. And Jamie was being kind. I think this is my 35th year developing software in healthcare. So today we're going to talk about the taxonomy of healthcare data quality. And I want to kind of preface this with the idea that I am a software engineer by background. I've been working in the trenches of healthcare for 35 years in different settings, from clinical lab, clinical trials, decision support, evidence-based medicine, and for the last 16 years of clinical architecture, focusing on data quality and data usability. For those of you who don't know about clinical architecture, I'm not going to go into it, but we do a bunch of things. We have a website. It's at the bottom of this slide. If you want to learn more, feel free to go check it out. So without further ado, Lord Kelvin in 1883 said, when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. Otherwise, you're full of baloney, or something to that effect. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about today. We talk about data quality. We know data quality is an issue. The real question is, what is an effective way for us to measure data quality? So the goal of today's webinar is to discuss the benefits of a standard taxonomy for assessing healthcare data quality, talk about the components that go into a data quality measurement framework, talk about kind of in general the patient clinical data model, propose a high-level model for a taxonomic categorization of healthcare data quality issues, use USCDI as a pragmatic exemplar to evaluate some real-world data, and then walk through that real-world example data and then follow up with some questions. So that's our objective for today. So what is the purpose of a healthcare data quality taxonomy? The idea is having a standardized, commonly agreed upon way for organizing and assessing the quality of healthcare data. Because we can say the data is bad, but this is a way where we can say the data is bad in this way or that way, which also helps us kind of get to the root cause of that issue. The next question might be, well, what does the quality of healthcare even mean? And for the purposes of discussion today, and in generally my philosophy is, good quality data is reliable. Bad quality data is uncertain. So a lot of what we're talking about today is how can we assess the reliability and certainty of the data so that we can, well, rely on it. Then what's the benefit of having data that we can rely on? And I don't think I need to tell you all this. Some of the things are listed there, but There's humans that want to use that data and be able to rely on that data when they're caring for patients. There's software supporting those humans that wants to be able to provide adequate or even wonderful information to help those humans do their work. And the nice thing about assessing quality and understanding its root cause, if there's a quality issue, is it allows us to maybe identify where it's coming from so we can fix it. And so in other words, is the data safe to use? And if it's not safe to use, how can we make it safe to use? So that's kind of the why. Now, when we talk about a quality measurement framework for data, what I'd like to propose is the following. You have a taxonomy, which basically says this is how we're going to organize and we're going to describe the nature of the qualitative issues that we're encountering. Then you have an information model that you apply the qualitative assessment against, looking at the data, and we'll get more into that in a minute. And then you have an evaluation criteria, because you can evaluate the quality of something, but determining whether it's fit for purpose is usually based upon some type of evaluation criteria. Something can be good in one context and not be good in another, basically. So we're going to start out by talking about the information model. And for today's conversation, we're going to use a basic patient information model because, you know, it's healthcare. So we're going to talk about healthcare stuff. So if we were to look at the anatomy of patient information, let's start by just talking about information in more of an abstract sense. Whether you're in retail or manufacturing or finance, typically information is characterized by a pattern. The pattern has an entity that is a thing that exists in the ontological universe of that space, right? And that thing usually has collections of data within it that fall into classes or domains, whatever you want to call it. We're going to use data class. There are elements within that data class that represent the items in those collections that make up the information about the entity. And those elements have attributes and characteristics that define and qualify what the element is, where it lives in time, and basically where it fits into the things you're trying to do with that data. Patient information is not different from this. You have a patient, the patient has different data classes with elements in it and attributes that allow us to look across the patient and try to get an idea, both as a human and as software, as to what is going on with that entity, in this case, the entity being the patient. So this is where we're going to kind of apply our focus with the taxonomy and the real world example we're going to go through today. Let me tell you a little bit about the real world example before I get into the other parts, just to kind of whet your appetite for the real world example. We have 3 batches of CCDA medication records from multiple facilities with a very basic, I distilled it into a very basic information model, and this is essentially what the data looks like. Anybody out there who deals with real world data, what you're seeing here does not probably surprise you. It's a very common pattern of the types of things you might be getting from an exchange partner if you're to receive a CCDA or a FHIR or OMOP or whatever you might receive. So this is what we're going to be assessing as we go into the real world example. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is the taxonomy. In this case, it's something that we've kind of developed a clinical architecture that we call the Healthcare Data Quality Taxonomy, or the HDQT. And I want to emphasize, and I'll emphasize it again later, this is not a fully baked thing. This is a work in progress. Our goal is to share it. Our goal is to collaborate on it. So I'm not handing it down on stones chiseled on Mount Sinai. I'm basically just saying, hey, this is something we've come up with, and we're happy to engage with anyone and everyone that's interested in being a part of it. So let's talk about it. So the HDQT starts with a very simple 2-level taxonomy. And I'm going to get into the weeds of this, but essentially you've got a top level which represents measurement categories, and a second level which represents measured dimensions that allow us to fine-tune the things we're looking at. Let's start by talking about those top level categories. So the first one is usability. And usability is really about the idea of whether or not the data itself is accessible to software. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to say easily accessible or reasonably accessible. So I'm not talking about things that I have to OCR and NLP out of a document. I'm not talking about things that I have to recognize in an image. I'm talking about discrete and or structured data. So is the data accessible? And that's kind of what falls into that category. Can I use it? The second category is accuracy, which focuses on the fundamental quality of the data itself. And that tends to be more at the granular level of the data. And I get more into that as well. Conformity is really about the assessment of the data within the context of the class and the entity and the use case. And transparency focuses on whether I can trust the data and whether I can ethically access the data. All right, so let's go into each one of these at the dimension level. So with usability, where we're focusing on, can the software access the data in a meaningful way? The first thing is computable. And that's essentially, is the information usable by the software? And this is a very simple one, because sometimes you get data from a partner or from an endpoint, and that data is just not usable. It's a scan of a scan, and there's just a ton of work that has to go in to be able to extract usable data and leverage it. And in healthcare, we do this a lot. We create puzzles that we have to solve to do things downstream. And so this is a qualitative assessment when I'm looking for a particular piece of data in my use case. Can I even get to it? Is it usable or is it not usable? The second one is interoperable. If I'm getting a data from someone else, or I'm getting data even from somewhere within my own ecosystem, is it, and it has coded information, is that data in an interoperable terminology that we've agreed upon so that I can just use it? So once again, is the data usable? The next one is comprehensive. And this one's a little slippery, because what it really means is, did I get everything? Do I have everything that I need? And I've included this because if you look at the USCDI basically says, these are the classes you will provide. If you don't give me lab data, I can't use it. So this is a very simple rule of thumb. You know, the data has to be there to even have a glimmer of quality. So do I have everything that I need available to me from a data perspective? So that's usability. The second, I'm getting ahead of myself. When we talk about usability, for the most part, this is something that lives at the element level of our information model. And in some cases, like with interoperability and computability, it could also be an attribute. Is this item in the medication element, for example, is it computable? And is it something that is interoperable? Has it been coded to the right terminology? With comprehensive, it's really more of a question of, is it there? Do I have it or do I not have it? The next category is accuracy. And this one is also kind of basic. The first one is it correct? And some examples of correctness could be, if I'm looking at an attribute, let's say I'm looking at a dose, or I'm looking at a result value. Does it have the decimal in the right place? If I'm looking at a discrete text field, is it understandable, or is it a number followed by a letter? Is it something where the data itself is correct within the context of that attribute or that piece of data? The next one is it complete? And this is where you're looking at things like, take a medication, for example. If I'm looking at a medication in a patient record, do I have a dose and a unit of measure? Do I have an indication? If those things are required by the evaluation criteria, I need those things to be complete. If they're not complete, that's a quality issue with the data. Something's missing. And this, the next thing, is it valid? And valid can have a couple of meanings, and this is where you can get into a further refinement of the taxonomy. Valid could mean that it's a valid member of the code system that I provided to you. So it's not necessarily the same thing as interoperable. Interoperability is about a contract, an agreement. Valid is, it's a valid thing in that domain. So valid could even apply to free text. A good example of this is UCOM. UCOM is a taxonomy for units of measure. It's not really a terminology. So I can have anything in the units of measure field, but it might not be valid in terms of UCOM. I could have something in a fill status field, which isn't bound to a value set, but I could still look at something and say the fill status is October. That's not a valid fill status. So that's the other question. Are the things that I'm seeing in this attribute or in this bucket valid? And that tends to lend itself towards very specific data elements or attributes of an element. And once again, not hard, fast rules. This is my pass on it to share with you guys here today. So the next one is conformity. This one's also a little tricky because it's very healthcare specific, at least the way I think about it. And that is when I'm dealing with something, for example, is it specific enough? Is it granular enough? And the example I'll use for this is a billing context in healthcare where I've populated the condition with an ICD-10 code, and it's a perfectly valid ICD-10 code. It's fracture of the femur. But to be able to bill with that, or to be able to even use that from a clinical perspective, you need to know the laterality. So even though it's a valid code, it's complete, it's there, it's not specific enough. I need the one with laterality. And we see that across different use cases in healthcare. Another example is if I give you a valid RX norm code, let's say I give you a min or an in to represent an allergy, that's perfectly fine. But that wouldn't be fine if you were trying to do a dose check on it. So granularity and specificity is something that kind of requires you to know what the intent for the use of that data is, so that you can make sure you dial it into the right level of granularity. The next one is relevant. And relevant is really, I tend to think of it as being more about noise. One of the things I've seen when you look at people that are sharing data in healthcare, you see a couple of interesting patterns. One of them is you get data that is really, really old data. The other thing you see is data that comes in a place where it's not supposed to be. Like you get supplies in a medication list or a medication in a lab result. The other thing you see is tons and tons of duplicates. Duplication, old data create noise. Noise is a quality impediment. So relevant is really, are these things meaningful and necessary to what I'm trying to do right now or not? So relevant, and once again, when we talk about these, I'm not saying how you solve for this. I'm saying this is a category of things or a dimension of things that you would create rules for, like identifying duplicates and finding ways to manage those duplicates out of the data. The last one here is consistent. And this one's a little clinical because when I think of consistency, it's both the presence of something that doesn't belong, like, Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other, or the absence of something that is glaringly missing. Like you have a patient and they have certain lab results and they're on insulin, but there's no mention of diabetes in any way, shape, or form. Consistency is where you're looking across the class and across the classes of an entity, and you're doing an evaluation to assess how much you trust the data. Does it conform with your expectation of the data? Is there things missing, or are there things that don't make sense based upon the other data in that entity? So that's conformity. And those tend to focus on the element level in our patient information model. The next one is transparency. And transparency, I'm going to call that a forward-leaning quality category. And you see a lot happening in the standards world around some of the things that I'm going to talk about. But I think when we move forward into the future and we start to really meaningfully try to share data with each other, there are things that we do not do today very well at all that are going to be absolutely necessary. Because a good example of the problems of transparency is if you look into a lot of EMRs and a lot of systems where people are getting data through data exchange, they get the data, but they do not incorporate the data into what they're doing. They have it there for a human to look at because there are issues about whether or not I just allow that information to come in and populate what I'm doing with the data. So transparency is about helping to alleviate some of those trust concerns. So let's get into the dimensions. The first one is very verifiable, and this is really important in a number of ways. And it's really, does the data, whatever it is, whatever, and this applies to really any element that you might get for an entity, but does the data include the metadata that tells me where it came from, the system, the facility, the application, ideally the author of origin, and very importantly, the time and the date when the information was introduced. When it comes to managing duplicate data, especially as we start sharing data with each other, you can set up an echo chamber where you get your own data back. So being able to identify the origin of the data allows us to understand that this is this same data. In other data, and it's not in today's practical example, but I took some lab data and it was millions of records. And I ran it through, and by looking at the date, the time, the result, I was able to identify, I think, in a couple of million records, over 700,000 duplicate results that were coming from other places that had been set up in this echo chamber. And so verifiable, being able to know the provenance of that data is going to be very important if we really want to make the most of it. And this leads to the next thing, and that's traceable. If the data has changed hands and somebody has modified, enriched, enhanced the data in any way, I need to know who that was, and I need to know what they did. Because one of the other things I harp on about, pun intended, all the time, is I always want the original data. Even if it's not interoperable, even if you had to clean it, I want to know what the original data was. If there's stuff that's been added to it, great. As long as I know where it came from and I know what the original data is, I'm good to go. So this idea of having traceable data, traceable, let's call it a chain of custody, is very important. The next thing is compliant. And this is another thing where when we share data, you know, we live in the HIPAA world, and consent is a very important part of that world. And not just necessarily at an overarching consent level, but in some cases, even at an elemental level. And the problem is, as we share data, we need to have a vehicle that shares what the consent rules are on that data. Because if you decide just not to share data, you could be missing something that's really clinically important when you share that data. But you need to make sure that the person receiving the data has the metadata so that they don't breach some ethical or legal barrier by sharing the data without obtaining the appropriate consent. So these are things that, once again, they're a little more forward-leaning, but I think as we assess the usability of data in the future and what we can and can't do with it, I think these dimensions are going to be important. And once again, these tend to look at the element, and really every element should have some metadata that helps us track these. And here's a fun fact. When I was researching this, you know, when I type in things like verifiable, traceable, compliant, do you know what all the references are that come back to me are? I'd have you guess, but I can't hear you. The answer is food. So when food moves through the supply chain, the fact that they know where it came from, they know who touched it, they know what the rules are about what you can and can't do with it. So it's only, I think it's a good analogy that the information we're feeding our software should follow the same rules as the food that we're feeding people. So I think this is a good model for where we're headed, and it looks like a lot of the different standards are putting in mechanisms to help manage this. All right, so those are the dimensions we've got in the taxonomy today. Here's a lovely picture for you to gaze upon, brighten your day, of everything in one place. I will want to point out that when I look at these dimensions and I create measures against them, I like to keep things fairly straightforward, so everything is a pass-fail. So I can ultimately do what we do with quality measures for patients. I can look at a numerator and denominator in a particular category and say what percentage passed this check by saying, here's the total, here are the ones, here's the denominator, here's the numerator. And so I just want to say that in this model, I'm treating everything that I do as a quality check as a true or false value. Okay. So here's where we are. We've talked about information model. We've talked about taxonomy. Now we're going to talk about the evaluation criteria. And for the purposes of today's practical example, I'm going to use a practical thing, the USCDI. And the idea here is this is something that if you're sharing data, it should be something that you're aware of, and it should be on your radar. But just in case, I'm going to go into it a little bit. And for the people at USCDI, I apologize if I butcher anything. Please let me know in the notes. So in a nutshell, and I've got the QR code for you, the USCDI website there, and the link at the bottom. In a nutshell, USCDI is a standard that provides guidelines for sharing data and really requirements for sharing data in healthcare. You can apply it to the use cases that are listed there and more. And it's made up of a collection of data classes that you see surrounding our patient Mabel on this slide. Now, for the purposes of my conversation today, and what I tend to really focus on is not all of these classes, but on a core set of structured clinical classes that tend to be structured data, so they should be computable. They tend to be clinical in orientation, and they tend to have some position in the time stream. So they are chronologically oriented and they come from somewhere. Okay, and so these are the ones I chose, and just to kind of pull them out, it's demographics, allergies and intolerances, immunizations, medications, problems, procedures, lab results, vital signs, and clinical tests. So when I think about the healthcare data quality taxonomy, I'm really focusing in on these. Could the same taxonomy be used to organize qualitative checks on the other classes? Absolutely. But I'm starting with the squeaky wheel, and that's this core clinical set. Now, when we talk about taking the evaluation criteria and applying it to something like a patient, it's important to kind of talk about the scope. So the overall level of scope is whether or not the patient themselves has good data. So everything we're looking at as we look at all the elements and attributes across the data, the patient's information model, it's really an overarching assessment of the patient. But we can get into whether or not the class is populated correctly, whether they have information in that class at all. And within that class, we can evaluate the elements and see if the elements are correct. And within those elements, we can look at the attributes and see if the attributes are of quality in nature. And so I just wanted to lay all that out. It's probably obvious to a lot of people, but I wanted to make sure I pointed it out. So when it comes to USCDI and the classes I identified, these are essentially the high-level picture of what they're looking for in USCDI version 4. And if you think about it, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but if you think about it, these things are the classes. Some of these are elements themselves, and some of them are attributes of elements. Today, we're going to look at the medication class, where each medication is essentially an element, and these things in there are the attributes on a given element. And so our real-world example, as I mentioned before today, is going to be us evaluating a bunch of medication records kind of isolated from the patient. So I'm gonna have to be flexible with some of the things I'm doing, but I wanted to kind of make sure you guys know where I'm coming from. So we've talked about having patient information model. We've got a taxonomy where we're organizing and categorizing the things we're looking at. We have an evaluation criteria in USCDI version 4. So now what we're going to do is we're going to bring it all together and go through a real world example, and hopefully have some time when we're done to answer any questions that you guys might have. So as I mentioned earlier, here's kind of an example of the data that we have. And I do want to point out that when you look at the data in the medication data class, obviously an element like medication 1 and medication 2, if there are attributes that are invalid or have issues or incomplete or not computable, those will obviously affect the elements that they roll up into. Just pointing that out. Now, let's talk about the actual value of the rules around medications in USCDI version 4. So here's our evaluation criteria, USCDI version 4. If we were to look at our taxonomy, and we know we're looking at just the narrow silo of one data class, and we know that those transparency criteria aren't prevalent in a lot of the data we see today, I'm going to take the conformity axis and the transparency axis out of the equation. That leaves us usability and accuracy. So if we look at the attributes in the medication data element, how can we apply these dimensions to this data? So computable applies to all of them. I have to be able to get them. I have to be able to use them in a meaningful way. The next thing is they all have to be there for the element to be valid according to the rules of USCDI version 4. And I also do some stuff with version 1 and 2 and 3, but I'll show you that in a minute. When it comes to things that have code sets or coded values, they need to be valid, or even in the case of UCOM, a taxonomic value, they need to be valid, and they need to be interoperable to be able to meet the criteria of USCDI version 4. And you can see their rules for their applicable vocabulary standards for interoperable, and in this case, valid. So those are the rules I'm going with. Now, if you wanted to stretch, you could look at this and say, well, I want to know that the dose is right. Now, to be able to evaluate the dose in a medication record, you need to know a little bit something about what the valid doses are for a medication, and that requires a little more of a clinical assessment. But you could also look at it and probably do a real world check that none of these values have a decimal place, and nobody's going to give somebody 400 milligrams of warfarin. But that's something you could do. You could also, with something like fill status and medication instructions, you could dig a little bit deeper and say, these are the valid values. But as of today, there is no value set for fill status. It really just needs to be populated. And in the data set that I saw, it was populated with all kinds of things. So let's actually take this data and let's look at a snapshot of some of the sample data that I processed from the data bundle that I mentioned earlier. So this is basically a copy of the data records that have been run through a utility that was doing the evaluation based upon USCDI and based upon the axes from the healthcare data quality taxonomy. Now, if we kind of look at what we talked about in the last slide, we've got certain fields that we want to be computable. There are certain fields that we want to be there so we can say they're complete. There are some fields that we want to make sure they're a valid code or they're in the valid spot. And then there are things that we want to be in a certain terminology or value set. So if we take those rules and we look at our evaluation criteria for USCDI version 1 through version 4, in USCDI version 1 and 2, they have a very simple requirement for medication. The requirement is that the medication be coded to RX norm. So all of the records that are visible on the screen met the criteria for USCDI version 1 and 2. When it comes to USCDI version 3, it requires that you have a dose, a valid unit of measure, an indication, just as text, and instructions. So there's a handful in this set of data that satisfy that rule. When we get to USCDI version 4, however, it requires that the indication be coded to SNOMED and that you have medication adherence information. Is the patient taking their drug or not? Or are they taking a partial dose? And that has to be coded to SNOMED. Well, none of the records that I saw in any of the data had medication adherence. It's probably one of those things where they're trying to drive that behavior, which is good. So they all failed USCDI version 4, even if they had an appropriately coded indication in SNOMED. So I took the data, I ran the evaluation, I ran it over 3 large bundles of data, and the results are as follows. In the first bundle of data, you can see that about 80% matched USCDI version 1 and 2. That means that they are either coded to RxNorm or had translation records that link them to RxNorm. About 10% were compliant with version 3, which meant they had a dose, an indication, and instructions. 0% were version 4, and I have this thing that I call V3+, which is kind of a hybrid version 3, version 4, and honestly, none of them met that criteria either in the first bundle. When you look at our HDQT taxonomy, the dimensions, you can see that 91% of the data, now keep in mind, and I didn't really think of this until it was too late, but this is everything that was assessed. So this isn't like looking at elements. This is saying every single field that I was evaluating for computability, this is where we scored percentage-wise. I apologize for lumping it all together. I'll do something later that'll pull it all apart, but 91% of the fields that we were looking to be computable were computable. That meant they were there and they had stuff in them. Of that data, about 40%, once again, this is using USCDI version 4 as a criteria, 40% of the things that were required to be there were there, total. 40% of them that were coded were valid, which meant they had a code system and a code and a description. And about 40% of them were interoperable, which means they were wired to RxNorm. Now keep in mind, or RxNorm, SNOMED, or UCOM. So if you look at this, about 80% had a valid RxNorm code. But when you look at everything else that had a code system, UCOM and indication, the total number was 38%. And if I were to take another pass at this in my little utility, I would probably divide all those out. So we're going to produce a white paper on this. And when I do the white paper, I'll break it all out and you'll see what the numbers are for each particular attribute and how it played out across the medication domain. For the second bundle, what you'll notice, and I'm going to roll from this slide to the next one. You see it? I mean, I went from 175 in group 1 to 172 in group 2. The numbers are almost identical. Now, once again, these are different facilities sending different data. So this is a different group of data. The numbers were identical. If I go to the third group of data, the numbers are slightly different in that the version 1, version 2 compliance went up, but the version 3 compliance went to 0. Now I went in and I looked at the detailed records to kind of assess why did USCDI version 1 go up and 3 went down. It was because there was more interoperable data in this set with respect to RxNorm, but there was never a place in the data where it had a dose in a unit and an indication. They never overlapped. So it never fully met the criteria of version 3. And so the data just didn't really cut it. The interesting thing is, when you look at this real world data coming from multiple places and you kind of pull it together into a single view, one of the things you notice is it's very consistent. So it's not like you're seeing a huge amount of variability. And a lot of this has been driven by probably the rules around USCDI. I mean, the fact that we're at about 80%. So if I were to take the other graphs, these graphs, they were very similar. It ranged from 78 to 82% interoperable. You still get records that have no code or just a phrase or nothing in them that you need to map. But the medication domain is pretty mature. And the rules have been out there for a while for USDI version 1 and 2. So when it comes to the medication itself, I would have expected a high degree of validity and interoperability. So that's kind of the real world assessment. I can answer questions about it when we get done. I got a few more slides and then we'll go right to questions. The next thing is, once again, just to kind of bring it into the picture, Here is the entire taxonomy. And I'll be honest, in putting this together, noting that some of these are more element oriented and some of them are more attribute elemented, help me separate them in my mind as in terms of the complexity of the thing that we're assessing. And there is still some fuzziness that I'm sure we could tease out, and I'm sure there are people probably listening to this webinar that say, oh, Charlie, you can make it much better if you could do this or this. And we would love to have those conversations. And along those lines, let's kind of talk about what's next for what we're thinking about doing with the HDQT. So once again, I want to say that we view this as a work in progress. And we work with a lot of clients that are doing a lot of things with data in a large way. And so a lot of our experience is working with those clients and seeing the things that they're trying to solve for and the things they're struggling with. But we know that there's a lot of folks out there that live in the trenches and deal with real data. One of the downsides of being kind of in a vendor bucket is that we don't actually have real data. We're kind of like, in many ways, like a genie in the bottle. Somebody has to rub the lamp and make a wish. And so we always look forward to the opportunity to work with people that are dealing with real problems, so we can come up with creative ways to figure out how to resolve those problems or mitigate those problems. So our intent at Clinical Architecture is to make this available in the public domain. We really want to collaborate with others who think this could be useful to them. And I think it's useful for us to move in the direction of something that we all kind of look at. And so the collaboration, I think, is going to be critically important. The other thing is just like I did with this real world example, I think the best way to determine if something is good is to use it. It goes back to what I said, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. And so if you take something like this and you apply it to real data and it doesn't kind of tell you what you want to know, then that probably means you need to refine it. And that's where you create a model where you can iterate on approaches and come up with something that really turns those light bulbs on and helps you identify, how do we go back to the source of this data and tell them, this is what we see and this is how you can fix it. We feel like that's something that could be incredibly useful to the industry in general. And that's really, whether you're talking about provider, payer, life sciences, value-based care, we might call them something different, but we're all really struggling with the same fundamental problems when it comes to our data quality. So with all that, I'm going to go ahead and go to questions. I don't know if there are any.
Oh, there's a lot of them, Charlie. You've had me.
Right.
They've had me.
We
hustling.
got 15 minutes, so let's do it.
All right, here's your speed round. First question: is blockchain likely to be an efficient way to provide verifiability and traceability?
I'm not a blockchain expert, and I'll be honest and say the distributed nature of blockchain to me feels like spooky action at a distance. So I won't say no, because I think acting as a medium of trusted exchange, there are cases where blockchain has been used to do that. But as somebody who's not really a blockchain expert, I don't think I could do justice to that question. So if somebody has an answer, put it in the chat and we'll share it when we share this later on the website.
All right. Next question. Could you please expand on your comments about fitness for use? Expectations for conformance to a standard such as USCDI only gets us part of the way there. We also need more contextual information about the data that allows for a determination that the data set meets expectations for a specific use case. Absolutely. So you're right. The guidelines set by USCDI are actually pretty straightforward. And it's really about setting an expectation for exchange, but it doesn't address things like conformity. When you start looking at data, and I'll share a quick story. And this is a conformance story, and it has to do with consistency and comprehensiveness. So we were working with a client, and the client asked us to build inferences to look at the data that was there and look for specific things that might be missing.
And so we built clinical inferences, and I'll just talk about one of them. And it was about diabetes. Diabetes is obviously a big problem. It's a dominant condition that we deal with in healthcare today. And they were really looking for people that had diabetes, but it wasn't in their structured data. So the patient's data record did not have anything to say about diabetes. And we thought, oh, that'll be interesting. So we built a cohort. We said, look for anybody with no mention of diabetes in a structured way. And what we looked at is, in this case, we looked simply at their lab results, and we looked at their medications. And we looked for things like if they're on metformin, but they don't have polycystic ovary syndrome and things like that. So we evaluated a data set. It was about 1 million patients. And what we found was that there were about 3,600 undocumented diabetics in a 6-month period. Now, when that was reported, and this goes back to the fit for purpose, the providers, their response, and it's a natural response, is, well, I knew they had diabetes. That's why they're on metformin. And if you were to look at their unstructured notes, their encounter notes, they documented that they had diabetes. The problem is it never made it into the structured data. So when you think about fit for purpose and what you're trying to do with the data, quality measures don't look at the note. Quality measures look at the structured data. And care management programs, they're not going to send a diabetic patient a reminder for their foot exam if it's in the note. These things need to be in the structured data. So when you're looking at the quality of the structured data, being able to identify these things are missing and improve that is a great case for fit for use. The same thing is true, like the example I used earlier. Having an RX norm code, even with a dose, without having instructions that you can compute, is not going to help you do a dose check. You need to have something where you can actually calculate what the daily dose is going to be and what the individual dose is going to be, so that you can make sure that you're giving the patient an appropriate dose. And those are things that that go well beyond USCDI. And those are things that when you're in your own use case, whether you're building analytic or you're feeding an AI or whatever you're doing, you need to determine what is my evaluation criteria and how can I do an assessment to know which data to let in and which data that needs to be refined or improved. And that's a long-winded response to that. I hope it's useful.
All right, next question. Are there repositories that have the elements that can be used in quality evaluation? For example, is there a medication quality repository that lists the medication name and their valid doses? Each organization can have their own, but to have a better repository, maybe a national repository for data quality elements should exist?
It's one of those things where it kind of exists. I mean, for example, the dose ranges for drugs, if you were to go out and look at Metaspan or First Data Bank or Multum or Gold Standard, they have that data, the dose ranges, to kind of do a broad dose check. And that data actually lives in the structured product labels that you can get from Daily Med. It's just not, it's like digging for treasure in some of those. You have to go find them. But theoretically, the information's there. And, you know, we built something at Clinical Architecture where we did the same thing for labs, where we said, what is a reasonable lab result? Because, you know, let's put it this way. What is a lab result for this analyte in this context that is impossible? So you can do kind of a gross check, but I don't know if there's one out there in the public domain other than maybe buried in something like the SPL. But I think establishing something like that, and you could argue with some of these things about, you know, whether or not a particular instrument might be a little different. That's where you get into reference ranges. But I do think that for some of these things like sanity checks, that kind of thing could be available and should be developed. But I don't know of any. If somebody does, share it in the chat.
All right. Next question. Would an application assess patient adherence for USCDI version 4?
Would an application?
Mm-hmm.
An application? I think that the challenge with USCDI version 4, this is one of the challenges we sometimes have with standards, is they ask for things that's almost impossible to get. The challenge that I see with USCDI version 4, and I understand they're putting things in because they see the value of those things, And it's kind of to drive behavior. You put things in a standard to help drive behavior, but like medication adherence is challenging, not because it's a medication adherence field. It's because knowing the truth of whether somebody is taking their medication or only taking part of their medication, I don't know how many organizations report that in a way that is useful. So I would say, are there applications that assess the data for USCDI version 4? I'm sure there are, and I'm sure that you can find them on the internet. The real question is, how can you achieve USCDI version 4? And it could be that getting everything but adherence is still great. Having indications coded to SNOMED is great because it helps you close the gap between they're taking a medication and why they're taking the medication. It resolves some of the mystery, and theoretically, it should connect the dot to the patient. So if I say the patient's taking this drug for their diabetes mellitus, and when I look at their conditions or their problems list, there's no diabetes mellitus, well, guess what? I can remediate that at some point. So I rambled, successfully distracted you from the fact that I didn't really answer the question. What else you got?
I'll give you another question.
Okay.
Someone else said, not sure I understand what is meant by interoperable, since my past experience with data exchange is that there are several levels of interoperability. Can you define what the level is you refer to here in this session? Absolutely.
So interoperable is something that cascades up. So if you apply it to an attribute, and this goes back to, remember, this is a taxonomy. It describes the nature of a quality issue. It's not a terminology. So what I'm saying, when I say I'm going to do an interoperability check on this attribute, on this code, is it available? Is it either coded to RxNorm, or does it have a translation record that translates it to RxNorm? That makes the drug interoperable. Is this unit of measure in UCOM, which is what I've said is my interoperable standard? Now, if I were to go to OMOP, for example, my interoperability standard would not be necessarily RxNorm. It would be the OMOP ID, which I might be able to infer from RxNorm. But so the interoperable is really, does it adhere? Does this element adhere? And for that medication element to be interoperable, all of its parts should be interoperable. Because interoperability is really, can I use that thing that you've given me? Because it's not native to me. It's not mine. It's not in my terminology. It may not even be in my syntax. But if you've gone to the trouble to put it into a format that we've agreed upon, and you've gone to the trouble to make sure all those things that I rely on that are dictionaries in my system, that I've translated from a standard to the way I look at the world, then that's what I might mean by interoperability. So theoretically, it starts with the attributes within that element saying, are they in a code system that I can understand? Are they all there, which makes the element interoperable? And if all the elements in a data class, that whole class is interoperable. And if all my classes are properly interoperable, then the patient data is interoperable from a semantic perspective.
Nice. So this is more of a comment, so you can add your own thought to this.
All right.
But to help combat clinician burnout, our quality infrastructure needs to evolve to extracting elements from unstructured data.
That's true. Or we just need to be better about creating computable data without forcing the provider to be a terminologist. I mean, when you think about it, we take notes, we put things in notes, and then we apply technology, fuzzy technology, to try to solve the puzzle of the unstructured note. And that also creates uncalibrated uncertainty. If I had a magic wand to fix this problem, I would create a technology. And I think there are people that are doing this kind of thing that captures the data in a way where it organically stores it as structured, rich, high resolution structured data and moves it from point A to point B so that both the clinician and the software can use it. Because I mean, it's not that I'm not a fan of NLP. We have a solution in clinical architecture that's kind of like NLP. It's more laser focused. But the problem is there's still uncertainty there. And if you leave it to a machine, either the machine that's evaluating has to be very transparent and very successful, or you just run the risk of creating more uncertainty. I also think the key to physician burnout is making sure that you have relevant information. So don't throw a tsunami. Don't just say, well, we've got 1,800 pages of clinical history for this patient. Here you go, doc. It really needs to be, here's the meaningful, important things that are relevant right now in the patient's clinical scenario. You can see the old stuff if you want to see it, but here's what's relevant right now. And when you present an alert, the alert should be highly relevant to the provider. Because that's the other thing. I mean, I was at First Data Bank for a long time, and one of the things providers struggle with is, you know, if you throw 1,000 drug interaction alerts at a provider, they're going to turn it off because they want to know the things. When a drug interaction or any kind of CDS fires for a clinician, they should think to themselves, boy, am I glad that it told me that. They shouldn't roll their eyes. And that, I think, is also key to clinician burnout. But you can't provide high resolution, meaningful clinical decision support, even with AI and ML or a large language model, if the data you're feeding it about the patient is not good.
All right. Got another one for you, Charlie.
Yeah.
How do you factor in proxies based on peculiarity of data types? For example, concordance of matching data element as correctness.
Say that again.
Tunde asked, how do you factor in proxies based on the peculiarity of data types? For example, concordance of matching data element as correctness.
Well, I might not be smart enough to answer that question. Right. I think that when you look at proxying information, you know, once again, there are cases where I think you can proxy data by looking at other data. And you're right. Whenever you do anything like that, you're kind of on a slippery slope. A lot of what I say when it comes to data remediation, I'm not a fan of just remediating data other than mapping it, looking at data and saying, hey, this patient's a diabetic, or hey, this patient has this other thing. I think that the human plays a role in this process, and software's process is to make the human's job easier. And if you're proxying something and there's uncertainty baked into that information, because we're still dealing with data. Think about it. A provider sees a patient, they've got something in their head, and they write it in their note. But when it comes to the structured data, they go to a pre-existing, pre-coordinated list, and they find something on the list that's the closest thing they can find. So the healthcare data that we use, the structured data, is big pixels. It's low resolution because I can't put all the nuance of what I'm thinking in there. I have to pick something from a list that somebody else thought of. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fuzziness to what we do. So my philosophy is, if you're going to proxy information, and this might not be the nature of the question, and I apologize, please feel free to follow up with me. But it really comes down to, if you're going to proxy information, you should take it back to the source and say, I found this. Please amend the record if you think it's appropriate.
All right. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, that's all the time we have today. Questions that were posted in the chat but not answered may be addressed by Charlie in the content on the webpage in the AMIA Knowledge Center, where the webinar recording will be accessible. Please check that page at a later date. Thank you to our presenter, Charlie Harp, and to our moderator, Jamie Lira, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.